You can be calm, you can ask good questions, you could be listening the entire time, and the person can still feel completely unheard. That's usually the moment officers start questioning themselves. What am I missing? Why isn't this working? On a lot of crisis calls, officers are already doing things that should work. But there's a missing piece that impacts whether someone feels understood or just managed. It's not your questions, it's not your tone, it's something else. I'm Troy Seward. After 30 years in law enforcement, I now train officers how to handle mental health crisis calls using practical communication tools that actually work on the street. And here's one misunderstanding I've seen repeatedly. When people say, "You're not listening," they're not saying you don't care. They're telling you they don't feel understood. That's where validation comes in. Many of us hear the word validation and immediately push back. Our response is, "I'm not going to just agree with people to get them to calm down." Or, "I'm not here to coddle anyone." So instead, we do what works for us in other situations. We clarify facts, explain what's going to happen, and give reasonable direction. In theory, that should work, right? But if a person doesn't feel understood yet, those moves often land the wrong way. Instead of calming things down, explanations can increase frustration. Instead of providing direction, our instructions may sound like a complete disregard for what the person thinks or how they feel. That's when you start getting responses like, "You don't get it," or "That's not what I'm saying." And suddenly, the call begins to feel harder than it needs to be. Now, let's be clear about what validation actually is. Validation is not agreement, and it isn't approval. Validation is simply acknowledging that a person's emotional reaction makes sense to them given what they're dealing with. You're not saying they're right or that their behavior is acceptable. You're saying, "I get why this feels the way it does for you." But for a validating statement to really land with someone, it has to do two things. First, it acknowledges their emotion. What are they feeling right now? And second, it acknowledges why that emotion makes sense in the context of their situation. It doesn't acknowledge that their behavior is okay or that their demand should be met, just why their emotional reaction fits the situation as they see it. Here's the difference. If you say, "I see," that's pretty neutral. It doesn't really do much. But if you say, "I can see why you're frustrated since you feel like nobody's taking you seriously," you're acknowledging both the person's emotion and the situational context. Notice what that does. You didn't agree that their story was right. You didn't agree that any demand was acceptable. You simply acknowledged how this situation is landing for them. Here's two more examples. If someone's angry, you might say, "I get why you're angry. From your perspective, it feels like you've been disrespected." If someone appears to be overwhelmed, a possible validation statement would be, "I can see why this feels like too much. A lot has hit you at once and it doesn't feel manageable right now." Both examples acknowledge emotion and situational context. Here's where validation often gets misunderstood, though. We don't validate everything a person says or believes. We don't endorse threats, justify criminal behavior, or agree with distorted beliefs. We just acknowledge their emotional experience without confirming the conclusion they've drawn. That distinction matters. Let's take a look at how validation changes the conversation when used properly. If an officer says, "Calm down, I'm listening, just tell me what happened," that sounds reasonable. But to the person in crisis, it can feel like they're just being managed. Now compare that to, "I can see why you're frustrated. From your point of view, it feels like nobody's listening to you. Help me understand what happened." Same officer, same authority, but with the second approach, the person is more willing to share details they might otherwise hold back, simply because they feel like you understand where they're coming from. That builds rapport and trust and deepens the conversation instead of shutting it down. When someone feels understood, their behavior in the conversation changes. They stop trying to just prove their point and start having an actual conversation. Validation removes the need for them to keep pushing their story. And once they believe you understand how the situation feels to them, there's no reason to keep arguing for it. That's when emotional intensity drops, defensiveness eases, and your words start landing differently. The validation clears the resistance that was blocking progress in the conversation. So remember this: validation isn't about agreeing or giving up ground. It's about accurately acknowledging how this situation feels for the person in front of you. You don't need the perfect phrase. Just acknowledge why their emotion makes sense to them. Now that you've got a handle on validation, let's talk about what comes next. In the next video, we're covering transitional phrases. They're a skill officers use to take the understanding they've built and guide the conversation where it needs to go. If you're serious about getting better at crisis communication, watch the other videos in my active listening skills playlist and be sure to practice the tools often. Until next time, stay safe out there and train to respond, not just react, so you can make a difference when it matters most.